Good. Okay, yeah, thank you all. Thank you for taking time out of your busy schedules to come to this quick summary of Anthos Multicloud. I just wanted to find out first, before I kicked off, has anyone heard of Anthos before, used it, or is this the first time you've heard of Anthos?
I've worked a little bit on it before.
Okay, good. So this is going to be a quick high-level summary of what Anthos is, and that should take between 10 to 15 minutes. And then I'll finish off with a demo and leave some questions at the end, so you can ask questions during the presentation, or you can ask at the end, and I'm happy to answer as and when you want to ask. So basically, a bit about myself. I'm Narish Samplay. I'm head of cloud engineering at First Derivative, which is a capital markets consulting client, and I have 20 years experience across various roles, from software engineering to architecture to my current role. And I've been involved in many data center migrations, been involved in the design architecture and leading teams and mentoring and coaching. And last year, after working on an Anthos deployment, I was nominated for the Google Certified Fellow qualification and assessment. And after going through the grueling assessment, which involves doing some hands-on labs and interview via an assessment panel, I achieved that certification. So there is about 50 to 60 certified fellows globally, and I'm number 42. And there's a nice website that Google have that you can visit and see everybody's profiles. And just before we move on, I just want to say everything that you hear today are my personal opinions and not associated with Google or First Derivative. So we'll start off with what multi-cloud is. You've heard of AWS, Google Cloud, Azure, and other SaaS providers, and everybody is consuming cloud in some shape or fashion, and some clients are using a single cloud and trying to do everything in a single cloud provider, and others are trying two clouds, and some are even trying three cloud providers. But the core principle of multi-cloud is the consumption of services from one or more cloud providers. Um, and the benefit of that is you can leverage common platforms like Kubernetes. So all the free cloud providers have a flavor of Kubernetes. So in AWS, it's called EKS. In GCP, it's called GKE. And Azure, it's called AKS. And these are all platform as a service resources that you can deploy to the cloud environment and consume them. And when it comes to developers and application teams consuming these services, if they can be abstracted in CI/CD pipelines, then it means that the target platform is kind of hidden from the application teams that are working on app development. So their interaction is with the CI/CD pipeline, and then the pipelines will target a specific cloud environment and then deploy the application to said environment. And the goal with the multi-cloud is you really want to be able to manage those workloads from a central single pane of glass, so you can see all your resources deployed, your application, the health, without actually going into the consoles of each cloud provider to see whether your application was up or down. And then also using the best cloud for your use case. For instance, if you're doing a virtual desktop type use case, then Azure is really good for Windows virtual desktops. Or if you're doing a heavy data machine learning type project, then Google Cloud could be the best for that use case. So having ability to use all cloud providers and selecting the best use case definitely is key to cloud consumption. And another thing that is quite important in financial services is constant concentration risk, which is how much of your workload is in any one place, whether that be on-prem or in a specific cloud provider. So if you've got the ability to deploy your workloads to any of the cloud providers, it reduces that risk. And resiliency is important, the ability to move workloads between cloud providers. And if you've got a tier one application that needs to be up 5 nines, then you may consider deploying that into two different cloud providers and having HA across the two. So coming on to Anthos then, what is it? It is basically an enterprise platform for running Kubernetes workloads that Google have developed. And it means that using the platform, you integrate with that platform in a consistent manner. You use the same tools, whether it's on-prem or it's in the cloud. And they have now developed solutions that work across AWS Azure on-premise. And originally it only allowed you to consume Anthos on VMware. But more recently, they've also introduced something called Anthos Bare Metal. So you can install Anthos on bare metal, which means you don't have to have virtual machines to then install Anthos. You can just cut out that virtualization layer and install it directly on to the physical machine. And over time, the product has matured and the use cases have also matured. So originally it started off with Anthos on VMware to allow on-premise Kubernetes platform orchestration. Then they moved into AWS Azure, and then more recently, Edge has become a reality. And looking at the website for Google Edge specs, you can deploy this on a Intel NUC, and as long as you have 2 CPU cores and 4 gig of RAM and 128 gig of storage, it will install. But if you really want to consume it at the edge, you probably need a bit more resources than the minimum that they specify. So moving on, then we've got the benefits. So when you use Anthos, it is visible in the GCP console on the left-hand side, and you can see all your clusters that are registered. You can see all the workloads. So it means that you have that single dashboard where you can see everything that's running across your environment, and you can also deploy workloads to the cluster should you wish to from the marketplace. And it gives you that single place to see the security of your cluster and multi clusters as well. So if you've got clusters deployed across various regions, you can see them, whether it's on-prem, whether it's in AWS or GCP or another cloud provider. You can see them all in the Anthos console inside GCP. And then for on-premise clusters, it has the ability to use OpenID Connect authentication, so that you have security from an authentication perspective. And here's just a diagram on the right hand side, which just shows that you have your clusters, you have various management features, and Anthos Service Mesh, which I'll come into a little bit later. And you also have for policy enforcement, you have Anthos Config Management. And this whole ecosystem is designed to make Kubernetes easy to consume and operate wherever you may deploy it. And then earlier on, I touched upon the different options. So the product is maturing and is having more and more variations of it. So Anthos Bare Metal, the top one, you can install that on Red Hat or CentOS or Ubuntu. So as long as the virtual server, physical server, wherever you install it, meets the minimum or the recommended specifications, you can install Anthos on bare metal. So that gives you the ability to use that anywhere, whether it's on-prem, any cloud, even a cloud that is not even mentioned here. So for instance, if you decided you wanted to install it in DigitalOcean, you can install the bare metal version, and as long as your compute VM met the requirements, it would work. There's also the option to install it on AWS, so that will spin up EC2 compute instances, integrate with the AWS API, and install. And one of the projects that I did in 2020 was an Anthos on AWS deployment. And I think that was the first one for in EMEA in financial services. You can also deploy to Azure, and also with GKE you can enable Anthos features, which I will cover on later on, and that's what the demo that I will be showing. We'll be using GKE with the Anthos features, and VMware is the on-prem option. So if you already have a VMware footprint in your data centers, you can use the Anthos product, and that can sit on top of the VMware virtualization platform. And then if you decided that you didn't want to run IaaS in terms of infrastructure service compute VMs, which then installed Anthos on AWS or Azure, they do have another option, which is something called attached clusters. So you can basically spin up an EKS cluster or an Azure AKS cluster, and that can be configured to integrate with the GCP console and have the same user experience. So what I'm basically trying to show here is that there are many options, and you can decide which one you want to follow, and you don't have to take the IaaS option. You can basically keep PaaS, but then layer the Anthos features on top of that. Any questions so far? Okay, move on.
I have a question, Narish, actually. So you said the Anthos clusters on AWS and Azure. So you mean managing the Kubernetes cluster, or only the compute instances, and you install Anthos on top of the compute IaaS or managed instance groups
Yes.
clusters?
So the way it works is they give you they provide a binary, and each cloud provider has a different binary, and when you use this binary and you pass in the right parameters, it will for AWS, for instance, it will provide the permission for spinning up the EC2 instances, and you have the concept of an admin cluster and a user cluster. So using the Google provided binary, it will bootstrap the whole environment. So you don't need to know any CloudFormation or Terraform. You pass in the right parameters in JSON format, and using the CLI they provide, you bootstrap an admin cluster, which is effectively 1 or 3 VMs, and then you can then use kubectl and Kubernetes manifest to create user clusters. So that's how it works in AWS. And for VMware, it's a similar concept. You basically need an admin workstation, which you use to bootstrap the rest of the environment, and that VM needs to have certain specs and certain software installed, like Docker. And then using that environment, it creates an admin cluster and user clusters.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah.
Cool. So moving on. So some of the features that you get, which is above and beyond what you Kubernetes provides, you have the concept of Anthos Config Management. And what config management is a way to keep your clusters in sync with a Git repo. So that can be like the baseline configuration or an application deployment. And I'll have another slide on that later on. You also have something called the multi-cluster ingress. And what essentially that allows is your workload to be highly available across two clusters without you having to do all the configuration of that. And then you also have Anthos Service Mesh. And if you've ever used Istio, Istio is an open source product. And what Anthos Service Mesh is the Google supported version of Istio. And then you also have the ability to run Cloud Run. So if you're on-prem and you want to run Cloud Run, you have that ability to do that. And then Connect Agent is how these clusters can connect back to Google without having to have firewall ports open. And this allows the clusters to reach home. And then Migrate for Anthos is a new feature, and what that allows you to do is effectively take VMs and port them to Anthos, and the whole orchestration is managed by Anthos. So it's a migration tool, and using the features of that tool, you can convert a VM into a Kubernetes container. So moving on, we've got Anthos Config Management, and I briefly mentioned it was a solution that allowed you to sync a cluster with a repo. So it consists of two components. The first is Policy Controller, which is effectively a gatekeeper. So if you've ever heard of OPA Gatekeeper, Open Policy Agent, Gatekeeper has taken over from pod security policies inside Kubernetes, and the policy controller allows settings to be enforced on the cluster. Config sync allows you to sync a cluster with a Git repo. So if you've got a Git repo that has all your application manifests, or it has your security baselines, config sync will make sure that the two are kept in sync. So if you've declared all your namespaces inside your Git repo, then if somebody was to delete one inadvertently, then config sync will recreate it by the fact that it needs to match the Git repo. And then using a policy controller, everything that is a security baseline that is enforced by policy controller, and any logs appear in cloud logging. And with Anthos Config Management, you have the option of using a single Git repo, or you can have multi repos. So what you can do is you can have a root repo that is maintained by the platform team, which maintains a security baseline for all the clusters, and then you can then delegate each namespace to the application teams, so that no application teams need to log on to clusters and run kubectl commands or run pipelines that run kubectl commands. They operate with the cluster in a GitOps manner. So if they need to do a new deployment, they update their namespace repo. And then as soon as they update that and merge it into the specific branch that it's configured to watch, then the cluster will deploy that appropriate resource. Moving on, Anthos multi-cluster ingress. I mentioned before, it's a hosted ingress controller designed for GKE clusters. So what you see on this diagram here, you see internet clients coming into a HTTPS load balancer. It's a global Anycast IP that this load balancer provides. So it doesn't matter which country you're in, whether you're in North America, you're in UK. Effectively, you have a single IP, and depending on where your cluster is, if GKE1 was hosted in US Central and GKE2 was hosted in Europe West 1, the Google front end would redirect users to the nearest region. And then if you've got a service defined as multi-cluster service on the Anthos cluster, then with a few Kubernetes manifests, you can publish said services and expose them to the multi-cluster service feature. And it allows you to basically run services across 2 regions, 2 clusters. And if, for every instance, you needed to take out a cluster or upgrade one of your clusters, you can do that without any downtime or outage. Moving on, you got Anthos Service Mesh. I mentioned previously, it's an enterprise distribution of Istio. It comes in 2 flavors, but the main benefits of it is this observability and telemetry that you can see inside the GCP console. So in the past, if you wanted to see what was happening in your cluster, you needed to log in into Kiali and basically see what was happening on your cluster. But what you can do now with Anthos Service Mesh is you can see the workloads. So you can see here, this is the checkout service. You can see how many requests per second there are, what the error rate is, etc. So all this information is available to the user, and SLOs are configurable as well, and alerts. So if you wanted to set some alerts up and you wanted to trigger some notifications, that is all now possible inside the GCP console by the virtue of using the Anthos Service Mesh. And if you wanted to see how busy a service was, you can see here that the request per service on that microservice that you've deployed is within, this threshold. So it is really good. And then the good thing about Anthos now is that originally when it first came out, it was sold on a CPU basis and it was all or nothing. But now you can basically buy as little or as much as you want. So if you just want the Anthos configuration management, it has its own price. If you just want to use a service mesh, it has a fixed price. And then if you want any of the Anthos on-prem bare metal products, they all now have their individual SKUs, and this list goes on. And if you click on that link there, you can see all the available options that are available. So what I'm going to do now is demo how you can use Policy Controller. So effectively, this is a new feature. This blog was published quite recently, and it was where I got this screenshot from, and is what I'm going to be demoing today. So what I'm basically going to be doing is creating a GKE cluster, enabling Anthos Config Manager, deploying a node, and then looking at the audit info. So just move on to that. So here's the GKE cluster I deployed recently. This is config manager here. It's the new screen that's come out, and what I will do now is go through the setup process. So you can see the cluster is there. It's all green. It's all healthy, and you need a minimum of 3 nodes. I tested this yesterday with a single node, and it didn't work. So make sure you have 3 nodes, and then you basically just click through the wizard. Next. So you first need to register the cluster. So this goes through a registration process. That's now registered. Policy controller is the gatekeeper that it's going to deploy, and there's the cost, you know, on so the 10 cents per hour. And Google have a repository with some baseline CIS policies, and I'll just show you what that is. It's effectively these policies here. So for the purposes of demo, they have these policies, and one of their policies that they have is around restricting root containers. So if you've got a CIS benchmark that says containers must not run as root, at the moment, this policy in the Google demo repo is all dry run, so nothing is going to be blocked from running. So if we go ahead and complete this action, let's make sure we tick the cluster first. So that will now go ahead and we'll install the components onto the GKE cluster. And when this first came out, you had to run kubectl commands and set this all up manually, but now it's all integrated into the GCP console. This will take about 5 minutes to deploy. So while that is happening, I will enable some logs. So this is currently in the process of installing. It will take a while. So any questions so far while that is deploying?
No, all good so far.
Also, while that's deploying, I'm going to deploy a pod onto the cluster. So I'm going to go into the Cloud Shell console, and yep, it's disconnected. So I'll just restart that session. So here I'm using Cloud Shell to connect to the cluster. So the first thing you need to do is set your project and authorize Cloud Shell. And then I'm just going to run some commands to make sure that we've got connectivity to the cluster. So yeah, we've got connectivity and there's no running pods. So I'm just going to deploy a demo pod. And that's going to kick off. So this is just a simple pod that Google provides so you can test your cluster with. And yeah, that is up and running. And if we go back to the status, this is still bootstrapping. And if you want to see in the console, you can type nomus status, which is a Anthos Config Management specific binary, and it's pre-installed inside Cloud Shell. So that's one of the benefits of using Cloud Shell, because all the prereqs are there. So you can see here that it's syncing with this repo, and it's synced to that branch, and everything is complete. And then this is also ticked with a green, and then eventually the policy controller will also go green. And we can see here now we're starting to see logging information. 1837 just come in, and you can see here that because we're running in dry run mode, my pod is running, but it didn't block it, so that's what we expected. So if we come back here, everything is nice, ticked green. So what I'm going to do now is I fork that repo, and I change the policy from a dry run to deny in my forked repo. So what I'm going to do now is change the repo that config sync is running with for that cluster to my own forked repo, and I have made my changes in the demo branch. So I need to change this to demo and click on complete. And then what will happen now is it will go through the whole synchronized process again. And if I run that command, no more status, it's going to connect to the cluster and verify the status. And you can see that it's syncing to demo, and the repo has changed. So that is still synchronizing there. And if we let that complete, the next part I will do is try to deploy another pod. But before I do that, we need to make sure that it's all happily synchronized. So we can see the logs still coming in, and because I'm filtering the logs on just the single constraint, we're not seeing lots of logs appearing. But as soon as it's synced, I will deploy another container, and we will see whether it gets deployed. So right now we can run kubectl get pods, and we can see there's 2 pods here. And while that is there, we can see that the pods were deployed and it was all good. So what I'm going to do now is try and deploy another pod. And with the old pod security policies, this would have blocked straight away. But with the gatekeeper policies, you don't get any feedback on the CLI. But what you do get is the admission hook preventing the workload from running. So here you see the admission controller blocking the request to schedule that pod. So if we look at the pods that are running, there's only the first pod, not the second one, after we updated the policy to deny the workload. And if we run the cloud login again, we can see here there was the dry run, and here we've got deny. So after I changed the repo to my own forked version, this is now running in deny mode, and due to the constraint don't run pods as root, it has blocked that from running. And that essentially is the end of the demo. Any questions?
I think we don't have any questions, Narish.
Okay.
Yeah, it is a fantastic session, Narish. I'll this recording I am going to post it to the meetup dashboard so that people can look into it later.
Okay.
Thanks so much, Naresh. Thanks, Adam.
Thank you.
Thank you, Paul.
Awesome. Many thanks for that.
Cheers. Bye bye.
Ciao, ciao.